Beauty. Thank you, guys. Happy holidays, everybody. I'm really glad to be here. I don't know how many years it's been. Is it still working? Can you hear? Yeah. But it's been great. It's the first time that where I'm here, and it's a great place. And I'll be back in the general area in Schaumburg for the Midwest Association of Rail Shippers, which is a big event. And we host a dinner. RJ Corman and I host a dinner, and we were for years in Lombard. And we'd go to Harry Carey's, and many of you know that's a sweet spot for me with baseball memorabilia and whatnot. So we're looking for a new restaurant over there, and they picked Mangiano's. So I'm not, my streak of being in Mangiano's every year has one more year to go. But I'm very happy to be here. This is really a great spot. And so I'm sure it works well for you. So I'm going to go through some of these. There's a lot of stuff. You'll have the slides. I am not going to read every bullet point, but if you have a question on any of them, you can either talk now or later. You'll have my contact information. There are a couple of things I'm going to talk about more. Let's see if I can get this working. Yeah, I just always like to lead off. This sets me. So a lot of these slides are just meant to be talking points. So this just resets me into what I think about the railroads. And, railroads have, 5 advantages. And then, maybe this one I'll talk about, obviously labor. Think about a double stack train. I looked at some double stack trains in the Museum of Science and Industry yesterday. They were a mysterious color, but the fuel advantage and also therefore an emissions advantage. We may be stepping back, and I'm going to talk about politics in a bit, stepping back from the emissions advantage. When I worked on an intermodal report all summer, one of the key questions I asked the stakeholders that I was talking to was, where does emissions and carbon fit in? And basically the answer was tiebreaker. At some point, that's going to move. I don't know, how gray my hair or how much I'll have left and all that. But at some point, that's going to move further. So these advantages, are important, but they're also ones that can be attacked, whether directly or indirectly. Autonomy, electric, and whatnot. So the rails must really focus on the infrastructure advantage they have, in my opinion. There are all sorts of new studies coming out that really point to the trucking industry underpaying for their infrastructure. Railroads pay for their infrastructure. They're taxed on their infrastructure. But the advantage of that is they can also plan their infrastructure on their own. This is the moat that Warren Buffett talks about, in my opinion. Also, they're in excellent financial condition in this period of sort of doldrums of the last few years when they had service issues and are recovering from the service issues and whatnot. They still produce tremendous cash flow. So they need to work on the technology things that are happening. If they need to counter, they have the means to do so. I used to think this was a huge advantage, and that is the ability to cut costs, to flex up or down, especially through furloughs and labor. Now, the former chairman and I, we talked about furloughs a lot, and I've come around to the way of thinking that agreed with Alan Shaw at Norfolk Southern, and this absolutely may be the last time I mention that name ever, but the idea that Jim Venna calls it buffer. The idea that you try to exactly match supply and demand really is a false idea. The idea that it's tied to the focus on the operating ratio as the goal rather than as a number that you use to ask more questions. So if you exactly say, I know what your volume is, if you have a known recession or if you have a pandemic, it's actually pretty easy. But if you bring to that pandemic a playbook that says we're going to furlough a lot of people, and then when we call them back, most will come back and most do not come back, you've entered a new world. So the idea that you can flex down rapidly with this, and whether you should or not, because if you're understaffed on the way back up, you lose a lot of confidence. The railroads have done this yo-yo thing for so long. They've never had consistently good service through a cycle. And everybody at Rail Trends, my conference from a month ago, everybody was talking about growth, about service through a cycle. And I appreciate sort of I don't know if it's a new mindset, but it's certainly a new publicly discussed mindset. However, I will say, is there anybody from Union Pacific here? Okay, that in comments last week, the CEO Jim Venna talked about if volume's flat, we have too many people. And I just get worried when you start to use the labor thing. I think the world has changed. That's an old playbook in a new game. I'm not saying he's going to do it. He's also the man who talks about buffer, about having extra resources to handle this. As you know, the railroads handled the comeback in the pandemic really well for a few quarters, and then things started going the other direction a bit. So the 3 body blows. This is a little history lesson. The railroad suffered from their view, the supply chain crisis, they were just a player. And, there weren't enough workers in McDonald's or warehouses or other things, weren't enough chassis, a lot of issues. But railroads are blessed with having an agency in Washington that does a good job of bringing them in and discussing this to them, with them. So they were, I think, seen as part of the supply chain problem more than maybe it was fair. And I'm not blaming the STB, or certainly they were known as, supply chain problem. All those ships off of LA Long Beach, steamship lines and railroads took a lot of heat. Second problem was the labor contract. It was actually, held up by a year, but it was the normal round of labor. It was, the railroads went from the business page to the front page, and that's never a place you want to be. And it became this idea that railroads were, inept and now greedy, and that this was, a new thing, and almost a strike, which I was really confident there'd be no strike, and I was borne out. The 1926, I think, Railway Labor Act has a lot of tripwires, and we went down to the last one. But once the PEB, made their findings, if you will, it was pretty clear to me what was going to happen. I always insert here that during that really front page kind of nasty process, my mother called me and asked why I didn't offer paid sick leave, to which I told my mother, I don't work at a railroad. I'm not a railroad, and I have no employees. And I work for myself, and so I don't have paid sick leave. But these issues became front page. And then, of course, there's East Palestine, and enough said about that. But that was unfortunate. I think the government, in that sense, was the unindicted co-conspirator. The government makes railroads carry hazardous materials because it's safer to do that. Several railroads, BNSF and Norfolk Southern itself, have tried to get out from the common carrier obligations in this regard, or to try to get different ways of potential compensation. Wick Moorman, the old Norfolk Southern CEO and later Amtrak, said, we're betting the company every time we do this. So, the government should have said, yeah, this is unfortunate. We got to figure out what happened. We are part of the problem here, and we're going to be part of the solution rather than they're bad. I thought that was deeply unfortunate. By the way, so how are they going to get out of it? One of the key areas here, and one of the railroads represented here does not have these. These investor conferences used to be annual. And if you're not an investor, you're a different, you're in the rail business as a shipper or as a supplier or as a railroader. You may not care about that, but you should, because they're now every several years. For Union Pacific this year, it was first in 7 years. For CSX, first in 5. It was a chance for managements to reset their strategies and to publicly talk about them, to understand where they were trying to get to, so you could analyze whether they were going to get there. It's also a chance to see all of the VP level people, the bench strength. So many people had moved around in recent years. There was a lot of worry about that. All these investor conferences were really positive, and they all focused on growth. And in roughly 100 slides, like I'm showing you, at each of these conferences, operating ratio was in one slide. So, it really was, I think, a different mindset. So the key question, I wrote this slide on November 3rd. Things have changed. I want a pivotal year where we pivot to growth. I'm making a fun sort of Keith Creel's famous line that we've talked about. Recent results were pretty good. Third quarter numbers were pretty good. Are the years of drama over? Again, I wrote this before the election. Labor peace in the U.S. is one of the big things. Three of the railroads have signed up. The next round of negotiations just began last month, and already I think 40% of at 3 railroads have signed contracts and gone out of national negotiations. I don't know how many have been ratified, so that's obviously a big thing. But there's an effort, and I would give Joe Henricks at CSX a lot of credit, to change the culture of antagonism between management and labor, to not go through congressional stuff and have everybody mad. So that's an issue. One railroad that talked the most in the last year about the need to change labor and about crew availability and about work rule changes has not signed anybody up. Again, that's Union Pacific. That's going to be interesting. Remind me if I don't have a slide for it because it just happened. The deal they cut in Eugene, Oregon is really interesting, where they're having the Genesee, Wyoming line switch and do first and last mile there. They're also taking 15 jobs out of 30 out. So already the smart union has spoken up. So 2 solid investor days again. I don't believe in the cult of the OR. I believe it exists. I don't believe it should, but I will give these 2 railroads a pass for a while, because whether it was publicly traded, we could talk about Ancor in a second, or whether it was internal commentary by the single owners, there's been talk about the margin gap between the two railroads and their direct competitors. So I'll give a pass. So here's the one thing. I don't know how much I'm going to talk about the election. I put this button on because the one good thing that happened to me on November 5th was my cousin got elected to the governorship in North Carolina, Josh. So I'm very excited about that. The rest, I'm now going to put my rail analyst hat on and not talk to you as a citizen. But there was a lot of euphoria. We were at CSX in Jacksonville on the 6th. The whole financial community, all the sell-siders, many of the buy-siders. And there was a general sense that this was going to be a good thing for railroads. And I don't necessarily believe that that is true. Yes, we'll see change in regulatory leadership. I don't think it matters that much at the STB. I think it matters a lot at the FRA. I think we will see better, faster permitting. But a relaxing of environmental rules is not necessarily pro-rail, right? A relaxing of pipeline agreements is not pro-rail. The tariff issue, I think, overwhelms the other benefits that may come. There's lower corporate tax rates may stimulate more plant building and whatnot in the U.S. It may. CSX in their presentation in November had a really smart woman who runs industrial development speak, and they had a couple of their customers, industrial development customers from Alabama, talk. And basically, what they said was it takes from 2 to really more like 5 to 7 years from starting a project to actually moving carloads. And that's if you have land banked for it. Right. So the idea that in the time that Wall Street thinks that the change in administration is going to lead to reshoring, I think is crazy. And the idea of tariffs on our allies. And then when you think about the tariff issue, and I'll try to avoid it after this, is think about what is the goal? Is it fentanyl and immigration, or is it trade deficits? If it's trade deficits, why would you back down? We have an enormous trade deficit with Mexico and Canada. And by the way, that's not a bad thing. It's just perceived to be a bad thing. So I'll leave it with that. We can talk about it if you want. So here's what happened at my conference. One of the during themes of the conference was how Canadian it was. I will talk about that in a second. Everybody talked about growth, and they talked about culture. They talked about labor opportunities, collaboration. There was a lot of technology issue. I want to really especially applaud both Adrian Bailey of Oliver Wyman, the STB speakers and 3 commissioners, and Mike Miller of Genesee, Wyoming, who basically said, I'm a founding member of RailPulse, which I think is an enormous diplomatic achievement. I'm happy to talk about that. But he said, I think it's great what we've done, but we have 1% of the fleet tagged. He followed Gina Tremblay of Wabtec, who talked about all these amazing things coming out in 5 to 7 years. And he's like, that's not good enough. Like, we need a sense of urgency here. And of course, there was always skepticism. Smoot and Hawley are, of course, Navarro and Lighthizer. One of them is in there. We still have an election in Canada. I'm not going to go through all of this, but it was a really interesting time to have RailTrans right after the election. Just to really quickly say, the reason I said it was so Canadian is there's a CN person just about everywhere. Ed Harris, I think, has worked at every railroad in the world. He's now on the board of BNSF. But if you look at this, I mean, obviously CN has got CN people, but Jim Venna, Mike Corey, John Orr, who am I forgetting? There's others out there, and it's really sort of remarkable. Keith, obviously. So Keith won our Innovator of the Year award for the merger issue, and that's also, you think about that, it's a $31 billion bet. And if we actually push through these tariffs, if the incoming president does what he says he's going to do to Deere or to the auto industry, not let a single car come in from Mexico. There were 2.55 million in 2023 that came in that way. And Deere, he wants to put 200% tariffs. I don't know what's rhetoric, and we've got to wait. I'm going to leave it at that. But, that $31 billion bet is that more at risk. The previous 2 Innovators of the Year were J.J. Rouet and Alan Shaw. And now we have a tariff in Mexico. So I think I'm the Sports Illustrated curse of railroads. This was the fight for Norfolk Southern, and the proxy fight was an existential fight for the soul of the rail industry. We've gone through a few of these in recent years, but if Vancouver had won, one of the things they wanted to do was to downplay intermodal, to refocus away from intermodal to carload, as if you could pull that, turn that switch on, as if the carload people weren't trying to sell as fast as hard as they could, while the intermodal people were also trying to do it. It was sort of insane. But had they won, I think that would have affected every boardroom, all of the other railroads, not just for direct fear of being taken out by even an inept activist investor, but where operating, it would have been the return of margin focus over growth focus. They lost, and now they've signed a peace. There are 3 members from their attack slate, if you will, that are on there. Claude Mongeau became the chairman. He is, in my opinion, the Hall of Famer. Hunter Harrison has become more controversial the farther he gets from walking on the earth, but he would change the railroad industry in a really big way. But every railroad he went to got better when he left it. It got better when he entered, in my opinion. It got better again when he left. He was not born with a diplomatic capability, for example. And I knew him since 1990. Claude Mongeau turned CN into the CN that is driving people all over the industry as much as Hunter. And so Claude's role there at NS will be really interesting. And I think that was just a huge win. I don't know, John, if you could say this, but I got to figure that Tom and Katie had to feel if they're a company owned by a single investor, everybody else had to feel if they won and the operating ratio improved, because it's easy to do that if you just start cutting head, you cut muscle, but for a little while you look like you're winning. And I think that would have been felt everywhere. That pressure would have been felt everywhere. And I think it would have been a really almost fatal thing for the industry. So this is one of the fundamental issues in my analyst community. Coal's down a lot in the West, intermodal up. I mean, I'm not going to spend a lot of time. I spent a lot of time all summer. I said on intermodal. I wrote a report right here predicting this line would go up forever, and now we see what's happened. A lot of things happened. Pandemics happened.
Tony, what's the gray cars?
Oh, this is actually, thank you. This is TOFC, trailer stuff. So back here, this would have meant, that would have been international, and this would have meant domestic. It doesn't mean that anymore. So that's why I kind of took that line out. It's critical that this grow. And in 24, it did. It's up 8% so far this year. Against pretty easy comparisons. This, intermodal does not have the margins of coal. That's why I wanted to have the slide before. But it can have a great return on investment. Going back to what I call the rail renaissance of the aughts, there were every rail stock was terrific. When I started as independent analyst in 2000, 5 people covered the biggest railroad, Union Pacific. 5. Now there's, at their analyst meeting, there were 120 people or something there. So it was, nobody thought they could do anything. And all the stocks did well in the aughts. And the 2 best ones were CN, Hunter, operating ratio, privatization, you're going from government control 5 years earlier, lots of low-hanging fruit, and BNSF, whose operating ratio did not change almost at all, but whose intermodal went, and I'm going to be rough here, from 25 to 30% of the total, something like that. So that proves to me that intermodal could drive your return on investment, even if it doesn't necessarily help your OR. The OR is an interesting number. I will refer to it, but it is not the end game, right? The end game is driving up your cash flow. And so an intermodal can be a big part of that. And frankly, what are the options? There is share to be recovered in carload business that was lost when there were crew shortages. They have a lot of paper business in the East, for example, that's going on the highway, and will go back when the truck recession ends, when trucks become less available. Right now, why would you go back? Yeah, I see the roads are better, but these guys are giving it away. So stay close. I'm going to use you, but not yet. But after you get your natural share back in the carload business, you're in a derived demand business. There's not a lot of share after that you can take. You have to hope the paper business does well, or the chemical business does well, or the steel business does well. In intermodal, you can control your destiny. This is really the story here. This is a look at it in the last couple of years, just a different way of looking at it. I won't spend a lot of time. My report, which I wrote 111 days ago, we'll talk about this. These are the externalities, the port share shift. Sorry, I was pointing. And it's going to be really interesting. Right now, there's been a lot of shift back to the West because of the ILA. Keep in mind when we're talking about labor that the incoming administration has endorsed unofficially the ILA position on technology at the ports, which is really interesting. Also, the incoming administration was endorsed by the Teamsters, which are the engineers on the side, and also the thorn in the side of the Canadian railroads on their side of the border. So it's not clear going back to that, what this administration will do for labor. It's not going to be as obvious as GOP pro-business, not pro-labor. But the port share shift is a big thing. BNSF has made a big bet, and I think CARB will go down after the changes here, in the big Barstow Intermodal Gateway. International Gateway. And I think that's a big defensive thing to keep LA strong. U.S. railroads want LA Long Beach business, even the Eastern railroads. They won't tell you as much, but they'd rather pick it up from Chicago than from Norfolk. They get all of it in Chicago and some of it in Savannah. Anyway, all these issues you can see about, and of course, tariffs and trade wars, that our old friend may be coming back. And then this is what happened that the railroads did. One of the things, I don't think PSR is bad. I think the bastardization, and there I'm using Alan's phrase again, and so it's the second time I mentioned him, of PSR, of the over-focus on short-term OR, that was bad. But also the initial CN scheduled rail system led to what Tracy Robinson calls curating the business. So you shrink your intermodal in order to, like pruning a rose bush, in order to grow it. So these are some of the reasons that this, that we didn't do what I thought we were going to do. And there's my cult. This is a TTX thing there. The containerization production index. This is the growth compared to, if you look at this, basically what this is saying is, and Larry Gross says this here, intermodal, which I think is the future and was the past, and for a few years now has underperformed GDP, underperformed trucking, and underperformed inbound TEUs. That's part of it is the share shift, but this is really what we're showing here in terms of containerizable business. A key element here is I mentioned the supply-demand balance. Railroads have to have a service cycle that is resilient, not traditional, which means that you do well for the first year in recovery. At some point, you have what we used to think was a rich man's problem of outgrowing your capacity. And it's like, well, that's good. You're growing so much, and their service is starting to get a little worse. But, people want to use them, and then they don't recover so much, and people stop using them, and confidence is broken, and that's an issue. So this is, I will say, at the growth hearing that happened right after you left, that Chairman Primus ran, although I think it really was not his idea. I'm trying to think, but
It's
Karen's idea. But I really appreciated Ed Elkins, the CMO at Norfolk Southern, basically saying this. We have to grow. We have to have good service right through a cycle. Through the upswing, we can't do the traditional thing, more volume means worse service. And I appreciate that. I will give Norfolk Southern also credit. If I'm a baseball guy, football guy, but the next man up, they pivoted very quickly in the changing leadership. And Mark George was at RailTrans. He didn't speak, but he sat and listened all day. I thought it was great. And my initial reactions around him, I think, are very positive. I think he's going to be good. Well, this is the ultimate. I've had one slide. This is it. The cult of the OR is anti-growth. You can have a better OR if you listen to Keith and you listen to even Jim Venna. Basically, this is the outcome of a process. Venna would say process, but if you're doing your things right, you're going to have an improved OR in all likelihood. If you grow your intermodal, it'll be a little harder, but you could show this in return on invested capital. The option is growth. Oliver Wyman, their testimony to the SDB, the speech that Adrian Bailey gave at RailTrans, I'm happy to distribute that to you, basically says if you don't grow, right now we're close to optimal operating ratio in the new labor environment and whatnot. The railroads should get to an industry 59, but if you're getting that to 58, does not generate the cash that growing from below GDP to above GDP in the case of intermodal, hopefully more than just above GDP. That's really the option. If you don't grow, Oliver Wyman said, you only have two options over time. You can merge, which I don't think is possible. That is, I only think we're going to see transcontinental merger, in the words of Matt Rose, if shippers demand it, and they're going to demand it when there's not enough capacity, and there's obviously plenty of rail capacity. But I'd love to hear your opinions on that. Or you can shrink. You could start to share assets. I mean, some of that's already done. If you look at British Columbia and CN and CP, you can become dividend plays. You can sort of turn the whole industry into what some people have said they were doing the last 5 years. So I really think this is the option we have. And I think the leadership at every Class 1 railroad now agrees to that. So this is intermodal just this past year. So here's the thing, Larry Gross, if you know Larry's the intermodal guru. He and I are good friends have been for years. He thinks there isn't a truck recession. I'm like, Larry, talk to everybody else. This is truck rates month to month, changing the producer price index. If you look at, truck rates are down, right? And so that's been an issue for getting this. Here's what could be done to get intermodal. With my report route, I would just hand you a copy and say, read it at your leisure. There's a lot of things. There's a lot of different ways to skin this cat. There's short haul. There's inland ports. The Eastern railroads are pursuing this. There's big. There's Mexico, hopefully. There's a whole lot of things. The partnership idea. One of the really interesting things that came out of RailTrans a year ago came out of the rail industry. RailTrans just reflected it. is that we have two competing ideas out there. One, and this is also the merger idea that Adrian floated, is that single line service is dominant, is the most important thing. And that's what CPKC talks about a lot. They are underperforming their STB mandated, what they had said they were going to do in terms of volume, significantly. But they are exceeding what Wall Street cares about, their cash flow numbers, because of the length of haul addition by combining, say, their corn business from CP to KCS all the way down into Mexico under threat with tariffs. But in response to the single line driven, this is the way of the future, it's been a series of alliances and partnerships, the most famous of which is Falcon, that's CN to UP to FXE. I would count Quantum and the JB Hunt alliance and the further tightening of the alliance with BNSF in that category, the Meridian stuff. I think that those are all great. But I will tell you that talking to the head of CN's intermodal, he said the thing about alliances are hard. Single line service, you have a single capital budget. You've got a single leader of that thing. With Falcon, I'm just going to use that example. You have three railroads, potentially conflicts of three budgets. You have to do that. There are all these new systems announced since mid-23 are exceeding their service levels. I would say that's true with Quantum, right? You're just using everybody's getting their on-time percentages are at the upper end of the range they expected. And again, I can't quote the one railroad I can't quote is BNSF here, but they're all underperforming the volume expectations. There is a truck recession. Mexican cross-border intermodal is down 8% according to IANA, which is inexplicable. And literally, we don't know why that's happening. As I wrote earlier today, my report that went out. But these alliances are underperforming, so that at some point, sometimes people walk away. It's not working. So let's say if the goal was to get 100 containers, I'm making this up, and you have 60, not 100, and you end up saying that's not good enough and you walk away, you have 60 containers worth of supply chains that bet with and on you. And if you turn them away, you might not ever get a chance to get them back. There is a railroad in the middle of the country that's now part of a bigger railroad based in Calgary that used to have a wall of pictures of golf threesomes with somebody airbrushed out, just an arm sticking in the air, of a former partner or savior of the company. And railroads are sort of famous for that. They can't do that. It's hard. This is hard work, and it's a garden that has to be maintained. I don't have any worries about the JB Hunt BNSF relationship, but all these other ones that are more complicated, you got to stick with it, even if it's not working at first. Here's more about the growth pivot requirement, operational stability, regulatory stability. There are a lot of issues. So I won't go over the risks. The risks to the second intermodal revolution that I see that should be happening are political and OR focused. I just covered the practicing competition and cooperation issue. I want to spend a little time on this. Mexico's moment. Now, forgetting even the latest 25% tariff threat, I've spent the last 2 years in a row, I've gone to Cancun for the Mexican Intermodal Expo. And I like to tell you now that I took that bullet for you guys, so you didn't have to go. And I went with Larry Gress the first time, and he didn't make the second time. And what was really interesting is they are not convinced in nearshoring. They see decoupling as a huge opportunity, but they don't think they're bringing it home yet. They are concerned, and it's mostly for political reasons. They started south of the border. First of all, the support for Pemex means that energy there is dirty and it's expensive. And that's a problem for multinational companies wanting to build new plants. Their foreign direct investment is falling below what they should be pulling in as a percent of Latin American GDP, as I pointed up here. Most of the boom, and it's, first of all, the peak in foreign direct investment in Mexico was 2008. So we're not even at the peak, despite all the headlines. The other thing is it's going mostly into plants that are already there. Tesla was going to build something, but Elon is not the most trustworthy guy. KKR had something taken over. I mean, the AMLO sent the Marines in to take on FXE to take a piece for his train, Maya train. I mean, there's a lot of stuff. Passenger freight, forced on the freights, that may end up being not an issue if they really build separately here. But sorry to have my back to you here. Border shutdowns, that's on both sides. The immigration issue and how that applies to the roads. FXE in their last quarter said that impacted them to a great degree. I think there are not enough Customs and Border Protection guards. If you're going to staff one of them, it is Laredo, not Eagle Pass, because of the trucks. the repercussions of the landslide in Mexico. They may get a good thing is they may eliminate their regulatory body, which every once in a while sticks its nose in. But it's an issue here. What's happening south of the border, the appropriation using the sort of rule of whim is not something you need if you're going to put a lot of capital in for a long-term supply chain decision. And now the concern is on our side. And the Canadians potentially rolling over on the Mexicans. So it's really important. We have two big railroads, two really good big railroads based out of Canada. But Mexico is 3% of the intermodal market now, but it is, I don't know. I don't know this, 20% of the hope for growth? Like this, it really has to work on the other side. So the question is, if you go in and talk to Mexico people, big shippers, the representatives of the North American Railroad there, the largest, I'm very close with the largest IMC in Mexico. And by the way, the IMC business in Mexico is up 221% year to date. So their domestic business is growing, and that's impressive. But it also comes from such a low base, I couldn't even graph it. The key thing to think about is number one beer in America and the sponsor of the world champion Los Angeles Dodgers is Modelo Especial. So market share, this is an old slide, but I just like to look at it. I won't let you focus on it because it's old. Finally, this is an old slide here that I wrote a report about 3 years ago when there were a lot of issues with first and last mile, and the Oberman STB was taking railroads on for the first and last mile. They still, it's still a part of the issues here. And I said, well, why not turn it over to the people who do it best, right? Short lines do 7 days plus. 7 days plus. Bill can call Mike or Sue can call Phil. And like I need another ship. Okay, we'll switch you. So why not turn that over? And I wrote this whole big thing, and I was very excited. And I went to a well-known second generation strategist railroader at Norfolk Southern. And I said, isn't this great? Should we do this? He said, never going to happen. The pendulum has swung towards class ones buying or taking back leases of short lines. A major Eastern short line railroad CMO called me up on the phone one day and said, I just have a question for you. Why do you think short lines are so good? And I'm like, I don't even like that question. I think that these guys could solve a lot of problems. It actually helps the OR, not that should be the focus, but there should be more opportunities. And the big one that we all talked about was in Dutchtown, the Dutchtown and Southern in the middle of Louisiana, where a Watco line took on like a 1.7 mile piece of the CN and switched all the chemical plants there and grew business by 40%, carload business by 40% in the first year. And I thought, man, that's, and pleased all the customers to a greater degree. Keep in mind, short lines are liked by customers, regulators, congressmen. They're the opposite of class ones. That people love trains and hate railroads was a line. I think maybe you used it, but and not the case of short lines. Everybody loves them. So why not use that? And then everybody said, no, we're not going to do it. We want to extend our reach. We want to get off of our line to drive more business. What J.J. Rouet, who did deserve his award, said is feed the beast. So, they are trying to buy the Iowa Northern. We're still waiting on that. Any news?
I retired on May 10th.
Okay, so and so we're but the move was, it seemed like the pendulum had swung from the 80s when they were all getting rid of low density lines, and then there was a little renaissance about 5 to 7 years ago, and now it seems like the class ones. But I mentioned the Corp, and I don't remember what it stands for, but it is a Genesee line around Eugene that the UP is using. It's about 28 miles, includes their terminal there, and I think it's really interesting. The question is it a pro-service, i.e. pro-growth move, or is it an anti-labor move, or is it both? It's interesting times, and we don't know where the administration will come down, and I might have done this for service and kept all the jobs for a while anyway, rather than try to stick the needle into Jeremy Ferguson at Smart. But Jim Venn is a chip off the old 100 block, diplomacy-wise. So this is, at one point in Rail Trends, and sorry to keep mentioning this, Rod Case, who is, many of you might know, longtime analyst and consultant, said that if we got, Elon Musk had promised 100,000 Class 8 Tesla trucks on the road by 2019. He promised that 2017. There are, I think, 4 now. But in 2017, that scared the pants off people. And Rod Case got up and said, if you could today have digital convoy of autonomous trucks, all of which has technologically close to happening. And remember, the big fleets turn over every 3 to 5 years. They don't have the embedded cost that we have with locomotives in our industry, but a third of the business roughly would walk away. And I think people, I was going to say pee their pants, but I can't say that. Come up with a nicer version. And, I think people really scared a lot of people. And now it looks like it's much farther away, but it's not never, right? Lance Fritz said in response to this, look, why would we have convoys on the publicly traded highways when we have a railroad that we're paying for right next to it? Public policy wise, his answer makes a lot of sense, but practicality, if these things are available, people are going to use them. So the railroads need to get their act together quickly. Mike Miller at RailTrend said, 5 or 7 years, not good enough. 1% of the fleet, not good enough. We have to have a sense of urgency. I think we do, but that's really the test, in my opinion. And the problem is, if you start to fall back a little bit and it's not working right away, that's when the Ancoras of the world, slink out from under their rocks and come back and scare us. So with that, we'll close with saying that you probably heard me say it before, but one of the highlights of my career was being the North American Railroad Shippers Man of the Year. That's what they gave it to me in Texas. When I opened the thing back up in New York to put it on my shelf, it said person. We were very woke in New York City. And there was no one in 2020. I'm the only 2-year holder of the belt, but it is really the highlight that the shippers, gave that to me. And with that, that's next year's Rail Trends. You'll have the slide, so you'll have all my contact info if you want to get a hold of me. And how did I do for time?